Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. So today we're diving into something really interesting. It's a conversation that's happening in Taiwan about the Taroko Express train derailment that tragically happened on April 2nd, 2025.
Yeah.
You actually shared an episode with us called
Yeah.
Dashu Hala,
Old guys chatting?
Old Guys Chatting in English.
Yeah.
And in this episode, these hosts are kind of reacting to the aftermath of the accident.
Right.
And it's really fascinating to kind of listen to them process it because they go beyond just the news coverage and get into some really interesting cultural and societal anxieties.
It really does offer such a unique perspective.
Yeah. What struck you as particularly insightful about their conversation?
Well, right off the bat, they started questioning this impulse to give large-scale donations after an accident like this happens.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were kind of like, is that always the best thing to do?
Instead of just like throwing money at the problem.
Right, exactly. They were like, do we really need to, does a huge donation always equal a better outcome?
Yeah.
And so they really advocated for more targeted giving.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they even shared this compelling story about a social media influencer who specifically chose to support a team of volunteer mortuary makeup artists.
Wow.
Which, just for a listener who's not familiar, these artists play such a crucial role in preparing the deceased for funerals and helping families say goodbye with dignity.
Right.
And the hosts really saw that as such a powerful example of a donation that's directly addressing a specific need within the community.
So it seems like they're kind of pushing back against that idea of performative charity.
Yeah.
Where people might be donating more for the social recognition than for the genuine impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did they offer any other alternative approaches?
They did. They really emphasized the need for transparency and accountability, this whole charitable giving sphere.
Yeah.
They want donors to have more control over how their money is being used.
Right.
And make sure it actually reaches the people it's supposed to help.
Right. Because otherwise you don't really know where it's going.
Exactly.
Right.
Especially after such a huge tragedy like this.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of social media, I understand that the podcast hosts also talked about the pressure that social media influencers face to publicly announce their donations.
Yeah.
What was that conversation like?
It was really interesting. They were pretty frustrated with this trend.
Oh, really?
They kind of saw it as performative altruism.
Okay.
Where these public figures, they feel obligated to showcase their generosity online.
Right.
And so it raised a lot of interesting questions about how social responsibility is changing in the age of social media.
Right, because, you have this public image to uphold.
Yeah.
And you're expected to behave a certain way.
Absolutely.
Did they see that as a purely negative thing, or were there any potential benefits that they acknowledged?
While they were definitely skeptical of the motivations behind a lot of these public displays,
right,
they did acknowledge that the pressure on influencers can sometimes be a good thing.
Okay.
Because it raises awareness and might mobilize resources more quickly.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword then.
Absolutely.
It raises awareness, but then it's also it's not really about genuine altruism anymore.
Right.
It's more about maintaining that public image.
Exactly.
Right.
And one of the hosts took it even a step further. He suggested that political entities might actually be manipulating public opinion to pressure these influencers into donating.
Really? Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, are you saying they're trying to kind of shift the burden of financial responsibility away from the government and kind of put it on these influencers?
That's exactly what his theory was.
Wow.
Yeah, he thought that, the government could use this outpouring of generosity to their advantage.
Yeah.
Kind of avoid some of their financial obligations.
Wow. That's a cynical take.
It is a bit cynical, but it's not entirely impossible.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense given, the level of distrust that people sometimes have towards the government.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It definitely highlights that, the need to be critical and really question the assumptions, even when it seems like, a straightforward act of charity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, the podcast also discussed the engineering firm owner.
Yeah.
The guy who was actually responsible for the accident.
Right.
And who initially tried to lie and deflect blame.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's just so heartbreaking,
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like this whole tragedy could have been prevented.
Yeah.
And even though, he was unsuccessful in his attempts to evade responsibility.
Right.
It brings up this really interesting question about, like human psychology,
Yeah.
Guilt and self-preservation.
Right.
When we're confronted with such horrible consequences, it's like our instinct is to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
Even if that means lying.
Right, right. Did the host talk about whether or not, like, if he had immediately reported the accident, do you think that would change the outcome?
They did, and it kind of turned into this debate about how effective the emergency response procedures even are.
Oh, wow.
Because some people argued that even with faster reporting,
Yeah.
the train was going so fast and the layout of the track was such that, timely intervention might have been impossible anyway.
Right. It's just like a really tragic situation where every what if leads to like a horrible possibility.
Absolutely.
Right. Did they explore any other aspects of the government's response to the accident?
It's interesting because they didn't just see the engineering firm owner's actions as like an individual failing,
Yeah.
but they thought it was like a symptom of a larger system that puts speed and efficiency above safety.
Right.
And they were also really critical of how some politicians seem to be exploiting the tragedy for their own personal or political gain.
Wow. So it seems like this tragedy really brought to light some like deeper societal concerns about accountability and transparency and safety.
Absolutely. It's almost like the train derailment became a mirror,
Right.
reflecting all these existing cracks in the system.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, we could even explore this a little bit further
Yeah, we should definitely delve deeper.
as we kind of like go through their conversation.
Yeah.
But for now, I think let's just pause here.
Okay.
And we'll come back and continue unpacking this really insightful Taiwanese podcast.
Sounds good.
So we're back and still kind of unpacking all of these really interesting insights from this Taiwanese podcast about the Taroko Express derailment. You mentioned earlier that, one of the things that they talked about was this like kind of generational divide in how people process information
Right.
and form opinions, especially after such a traumatic event.
Yeah.
How did they see those differences like playing out?
Well, the hosts themselves, being from an older generation, they noticed this contrast between, how they consume information and form opinions, and younger people, like digital natives. They grew up relying on traditional media, like newspapers and TV,
Yeah.
which kind of encouraged like a slower pace,
Right.
More measured intake of information.
Yeah.
And now you have younger people who are just bombarded with real-time updates and opinions.
They're misinformation probably.
And misinformation, yeah, constantly on social media.
Right.
So it's just a completely different information environment.
Yeah. So how do you think they saw that kind of shaping the understanding of events like this?
Well, they definitely acknowledged, the good things about having instant access to information,
Yeah.
but they did worry about this potential for information overload
Oh, yeah.
and like emotional fatigue.
Right.
Especially for younger audiences who are constantly exposed to, graphic images and really unfiltered commentary online.
It's almost like this constant exposure to trauma.
Exactly.
Right.
And they worried that this could make it harder for people to think rationally
Right.
and understand the situation, and that it could lead to like knee-jerk reactions and misguided blame instead of, like thoughtful analysis.
Right. And moving beyond like just, the individual actions and reactions and kind of looking at more the government's response to the derailment.
Yeah.
What stood out to you in their critique of how the government handled things?
Well, they were very skeptical
Really?
about how the government was handling the situation, especially when it came to transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
They felt like there was more of an emphasis on protecting reputations and, like damage control
Yeah.
than actually addressing the root causes of the accident, supporting the victims.
So it sounds like there's a real sense of distrust there.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
What specific aspects of the government's response did they find the most problematic?
Well, they were really critical of what they saw as inadequate safety regulations
Yeah.
for the rail system. They kind of argued that this focus on speed and efficiency might have led to, some complacency,
Right.
and that warning signs were ignored and potential risks were downplayed.
It's scary to think that maybe, with stricter protocols,
Yeah.
it could have been avoided.
Absolutely.
Did they offer any kind of insight into how to like change that culture?
They did. They really called for like a complete overhaul of the system.
Wow.
They wanted stricter regulations, independent oversight,
Yeah.
and a renewed focus on putting safety above everything else.
So it's more about like a systemic shift as opposed to just individual actions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They saw this tragedy as a wake-up call,
Right.
that neglecting safety can have just catastrophic consequences.
Yeah, and speaking of consequences, they also talked about the compensation for the victims' families.
Yeah,
I imagine that was a really emotional part of the conversation.
it was. They really felt like the government's initial offers of compensation were not enough. Like almost insulting, considering, just the immense loss and suffering that these families went through.
Yeah.
They really argued for a more holistic approach.
Yeah.
Something that went beyond just financial aid
Yeah.
to include like long-term emotional and psychological support.
Right, because it's not just about money. It's about,
Exactly.
right, it's about the long road to healing.
Exactly. They didn't want the government to just throw money at the problem and say, okay, we're done.
Right.
They wanted them to acknowledge that these families have a really long journey ahead of them
Yeah.
and that they need resources and support to navigate that.
It's really a powerful message about the need for empathy.
Yeah.
And understanding in the face of tragedy.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And they also talked about kind of collective trauma and the nation's response to the accident.
Right.
But I think we'll save that for our final segment.
Yeah, there's still so much more to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about. Okay, so we're back and ready to kind of wrap up our deep dive into this Taiwanese podcast reaction to the Taroko Express derailment. In the last part, we were talking about how they discussed this idea of collective trauma and the nation's response to the accident. I'm really curious to hear more about their perspective on that.
Yeah, well, they really captured, that sense of loss and vulnerability that kind of swept through Taiwanese society after this accident.
Right.
It wasn't just the families of the victims who were grieving.
Yeah.
It was like the entire nation was grappling with this idea of the fragility of life and, questioning their faith in the systems that they rely on.
Right. It's like it shattered their sense of security.
Exactly.
And forced them to confront, their own mortality in a really direct way.
Yeah.
So how did they talk about, how a nation even begins to heal from such a collective trauma?
Well, they really emphasized the importance of communal healing,
Oh, interesting.
highlighting, things like rituals and memorials and shared stories
Okay.
as ways to help people cope with grief and find meaning in the midst of tragedy.
Right.
They saw these acts of collective remembrance as really crucial steps in processing the loss and finding strength in unity.
That makes sense. There's power in shared experience.
Absolutely.
Knowing that you're not alone in your grief.
Yeah.
Did they suggest any specific actions or approaches to kind of facilitate this communal healing?
They really stressed the importance of open and honest dialogue.
Oh, okay.
Even if it's uncomfortable or challenging.
Yeah.
They felt that, suppressing grief or avoiding difficult conversations would only make the healing process longer.
Right. So it's about creating spaces for vulnerability
Exactly.
and allowing those difficult emotions to surface
Absolutely.
so they can be acknowledged and processed.
Yeah.
So did they see this tragedy as purely, a source of pain and loss, or did they find any glimmer of hope or
Yeah.
potential for positive change coming out of it?
Well, they were really adamant that this accident should not be in vain.
Okay.
They saw it as a catalyst for positive change.
Okay.
They urged their listeners to use this tragedy as a springboard for, pushing for systemic reforms and improved safety protocols and just a renewed commitment to holding those in power accountable.
Right. So it's about transforming that grief into action.
Absolutely.
Taking those lessons learned and using them to build a safer, more resilient society.
Exactly.
Did they talk about this idea of forgiveness?
They did.
Especially when it comes to, those who are responsible for the accident.
Yeah, they acknowledged how difficult it is
Yeah.
to grapple with forgiveness in a situation like this.
Right.
They recognized the need for justice and accountability,
Yeah.
but they also emphasized that, forgiveness is a deeply personal journey.
It's a tough balance.
It
Because you're seeking justice for the victims.
Yeah.
But you also want to find a way to move forward without being consumed by anger and resentment.
Exactly. And they encouraged their listeners to approach this question thoughtfully and compassionately, recognizing that there's no right or wrong way to deal with forgiveness.
One final point that I thought was really powerful was their emphasis on the importance of cultural memory.
Yeah.
It seemed like they felt this responsibility to ensure that the victims were not forgotten
Right.
and that the lessons learned from this tragedy would endure.
Absolutely. They believed that remembering and honoring the victims was crucial to preventing future tragedies.
Right.
They saw this event as a stark reminder of the human cost of negligence
Yeah.
and a call to action to create a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to happen.
So it's about using the past to inform the future.
Exactly.
Right? Carrying the memory of those lost forward as a way to guide us in our pursuit of a safer, more just world.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've gone beyond just the surface level news coverage to explore the deeper cultural and societal implications of this tragedy. And, by looking at it through the lens of this Taiwanese podcast, we've gotten such unique insights.
It's been a privilege to unpack these complex themes.
Yeah, I think there's a really valuable lesson here for all of us in listening to these conversations that are happening outside of our immediate circles.
Absolutely.
It broadens our understanding, it challenges our assumptions, and it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's always the potential for growth and healing and positive change.
I completely agree.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and reflection. And we encourage you to continue seeking out diverse perspectives and engaging in those meaningful conversations that challenge your worldview.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep diving deep.